Now we're going to follow up and continue our analysis of the differences between the Asian and African refugees on PTSD symptoms. Remember, we checked the normality issue and that we found that the distribution for the two variables was slightly skewed. We did a transformation in order to reduce some of that skewness, did the square root of the original PTSD. So now we have a new variable, the square root of PTSD, which is going to be what we actually test the differences in the PTSD levels of PTSD. Keeping in mind that whenever you do a transformation of a variable, like taking the square root or the log or something like that in order to deal with issues of normality, you are not altering the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable, between, in this case, whether you are an African or Asian refugee and PTSD. You're not altering that relationship by doing that transformation, because you're basically adding a constant to all of the variables, and all of everybody's PTSD scores is being changed in the same direction with this square root, and therefore the relationship between PTSD and any other variable that you might be looking at it being related to is not going to change. It's just that the scale that you are measuring PTSD has now been altered. Okay. We need to make sure, remember in that previous data file, we did a split file. So we split the file based on county in order to get output divided up by the different groupings, the Asian versus African refugee grouping. We need to make sure that that is turned off. In fact, I had closed the data set and reopened it, and any of those split file options are automatically sort of reset whenever you close and open the file. But if I had not done that, I would have needed to go back to split file and basically just done what I've done here, which I'm doing here, which is go up to analyze all cases, do not create groups, and do that as okay. That basically turns off the split file option. So in order to carry out my independent sample t-test analysis, compare means, independent sample. The dependent variable is now the transformed new variable of PTSD. The independent variable is country. And the groups were 0 and 1 were the way in which the groups were labeled. So I need to put that in here so it knows how to identify the groups. I'm just going to check out the options to see what my options are. Again, this is where I would, if I wanted to change the alpha level, I'd go in here and change the alpha level, but we're going to stay at the 0.05 level. And now we're just going to do OK to execute that command. And here are our results for our two samples, the Asian and the African. We've got the basic descriptive statistics for those two samples, where we have the sample size, the mean, the standard deviation, the standard error of the mean for each of those groups. And then what we're really interested in is now the results of our t-test, keeping in mind that with our t-test, we can carry out the t-test using the assumption or retaining the assumption that the variances are equal, or we could carry out our t-test under the assumption that the variances are not equal. The Levine's test provides us with a test of the equivalency of the variances. What we're interested in is whether the p-value for here is less than 0.05. If the p is less than 0.05, less than or equal to 0.05, then we can assume that the variances are equal. If we can't assume the variance is equal, then we would read that bottom line to interpret the results of our t. Otherwise, if the p-value is greater than 0.05, then we can assume that the variances are equal, and we can focus our discussion of the results on the top line, right? So again, the non-equivalency of the variance does not prevent us from carrying out the t-test. It just will mean that we have to either work with values associated with making the assumption of there being equal variance, or values associated with us not making that assumption. Okay? All right. So in looking at these results, where we can assume that the variances are equal, so we're focusing on that top line, we can interpret these results as indicating, since the p-value is less than 0.05, we can interpret that the difference, the mean difference, the average difference between the participants who were African as opposed to Asian refugees, because the confidence interval, because the p-value is less than 0.05, and because the confidence interval does not include 0, we can interpret that in fact the Africans mean of 3.7 on this PTSD, and this is actually the squared. When you have to go back to, keep in mind we have to go back in this interpretation, we have to go back to the actual values, the unsquared values. So these means here are the square rooted values. Our interpretation will go back to the original raw scores for PTSD. So let's take a look at that for a second. So here's what the original raw scores are: a 12.1 versus a 15.0, or 12.2. You could round that up to 0.2. And you could actually round that up to a 15.0. That basically our interpretation would be based on the analysis that indicated significant difference between those two groups. We would interpret that in fact the Africans' mean PTSD score of about 15 is significantly different from the mean PTSD score of 12 for the Asians.